Our next presentation is titled, What is the Role of the Engineer in Bringing About a Thriving Future? I'd now like to welcome to the stage Mary Casey, Director of Social Infrastructure at HKA. Mary has over 20 years of experience in Australia and internationally, across projects in nearly every building type. She has worked as an artist, an architect, a trainer, a facilitator, a sustainability consultant, a project manager, and a management consultant. A founding director and past chair of the board of the Living Future Institute of Australia. She was named a Living Building Hero by the International Living Future Institute in 2014. Please welcome Mary Casey.
Good morning. And thank you very much, Mark, and thank you, Were and Michael, for your welcome and sharing of your cultural wisdom with us. I'm going to see if I can share my screen successfully. So what is the role of an engineer in a thriving future? So I know sorry, I'm going to back up and say that I am speaking to you from Gadigal land in the Eora Nation, and I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And before we move into examples of good design and sexy buildings and cool technology that I know we'll be talking about later today, I think there is a foundational conversation that needs to be had about what's in the background, what's unspoken about our accepted conventions about who we are and our limitations and how those have created our current reality. And if we want to change our built environment, the first change to make is internal. It's about us and who we are being and what we are in service to. So I want to use this time to speak with you about us as a community of professionals owning our role in a future where life is thriving. And since design professionals have declared a climate emergency, I thought we might use Thomas Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions as a context for this conversation. Now, Kuhn talked about science advancing as a cycle of revolutions and that this was a natural process and part of how we evolve our understanding of the world in which we live. And here's a quick diagram of his model. So starting at the top, with normal science, we make measurements and articulate theories about how we relate to our world and understand how it works. And often an anomaly arises that is in conflict with our normal science. And when that happens, we tend to blame the apparatus or set aside the problem. But if the anomaly persists and it turns out to not be an anomaly, we find ourselves in a moment of crisis. And that's an opportunity for us to see the problem from a different perspective and develop a new way of thinking about the world. There's a period of chaos where multiple different options are explored, and then alternative concepts start to get consensus around a particular one, and that's when we see the paradigm shift, and then that becomes normal science. I think our normal science since the Industrial Revolution has been that we are separate from nature and that we operate upon these systems from some external location, and that the consequences of those manipulations do not affect us. Or if they do, we just adjust the manipulations to increase the output, like working the levers of some giant machine. And this norm has allowed us to forget that these are living systems within which we are nested, alienating us from our place and leading to a lack of ownership or responsibility for the results of our design. And we're now seeing evidence that we're not separate, that this is not a one-off, this is a pattern, and that we have arrived at a moment of crisis. Now, this particular crisis is not scientific. Scientists have been telling us this was coming for quite some time. So I would suggest that what we have is more of a design crisis. There's a lot of data that we could look at, and we've seen most of it before, so I'm going to focus on one aggregate indicator to support that statement, which is the creation of the term anthropocene. Human beings are creating changes to the Earth's ecosystems at such a significant level that we are now naming a geologic age after our species. This age of humans is the sixth mass extinction. Some have even described the loss of biodiversity today as biological annihilation. So our behavior in relationship to the place that gives us life is causing degradation to the systems upon which we depend for our existence. Now, you may think this new term is appropriate, or you may consider it unnecessarily provocative, but the utility of the term, in my view, comes from its potential to help us see the scope and the nature of our impact. And we're now moving into the change in worldview moment where we can see things from a new perspective. So I think, in summary, the definition of the crisis is that the scale of the impact we have is planetary, the character of the impact we are having is damage, and the possible new perspective is the difference we can make if we change our behavior is planetary, and the character of the impact we can have can be benefit. Now, the trick is you can't change behavior unless you have a change in mindset. And mindset shifts are not easy because, for the most part, we're not consciously aware of them. They are automatic. They're a set of assumptions in the background unnoticed. But as we can see, the mindset from which we operate is what determines our result. So let's look at some possible mindsets we could adopt. This graph is a great representation of the two dominant ways to have a conversation about our impact and everything in between. On the left-hand side, we have normal science, where we're essentially saying we're separate and what we make has a negative impact on nature, so we'll focus on being less bad. When we consider how we might shift for a better result for Earth, we find a major diminishing returns problem, which is that the best design is for no humans. And that's why most people avoid talking about this issue. The other way to have this conversation is to talk about what good looks like. And this is an abundant conversation. It's values-based, and it's about the contribution we want to make, where the more we do of what we're doing, the better the result for Earth. And we know we're not in the right-hand space right now, and I think there are three key shifts we should consider if we want to move over there. So at a high level, here they are, and I'll explain each of these more in a minute. But in summary, if we can move from separation to integration and create meaningful connection with place, if we can go from fixed ways of thinking to flowing ways of thinking, aligning our technical processes with life processes, and if we can move from a scarcity mindset to abundance mindset and become regenerative in the way that we work. So shift one, separation to integration. In Western thought, we have created a pattern to understand called take it apart and put it back together again, as if by understanding the components, you could understand the whole thing, which is fine as far as it goes. It does help you understand components. It would help you look at a stomach and get that it digests food by secreting acid to break it down into something your body can metabolize. But this way of looking at things doesn't make it possible for you to see the stomach's role in the nervous system, that it's a key player in signaling fear. And in doing so, you miss out on a really important function of the stomach in the overall system of the body. Now, this way of thinking has led to a pattern of working that has used fragmentation as the method for designing solutions. And we are now facing the consequences of that way of working, with lots of disconnected pieces that do not work together as a whole that evokes connection or emotion or ownership. And even though we're trying to address the issue proactively and helpfully, because we're still operating from this way of thinking, we end up perpetuating the overall entropy in the system, and the problem persists and even worsens. So we get out of this trap by working with wholes and moving to thinking in things in terms of integration, which is something that indigenous cultures do extremely well and have done for ages and ages, because wholes are the basis of living systems. When you're working with wholes, you become interested in the particular character of the person or the place or the region. You're interested in what your actions and your interventions might do to enhance that character. What would support this to thrive? So it's all about what will work here. It's not about replicating something you applied on the last job that was successful in another location. It's about working with the distinctiveness and the uniqueness of each project. So wholes are the first step. Step 2 is fixed to flowing. So this is about observing not how the systems are structured, but how they operate. So what are their characteristics in action, which leads us to 2 key ideas, boundaries and flows. So the first one, boundaries. The temptation for us is to think about our projects as being constrained to its plot of land or its property line. But this is incorrect, as your building affects and is affected by things that go beyond that property line. So what we want to do is consider the largest whole possible. So if your goal is to be world leading, then your boundary is Earth. If your goal is to address your supply chain, your boundary is probably also Earth, even if you want to focus on local sourcing, because you have to consider the entire system. Secondly, with flows, in systems thinking, everything is acknowledged as a continuous process. Nothing has a start or a finish. A building is not a discrete object, it's an intervention into an existing system. So you could imagine that there's a symphony being played in any particular place, and your building is going to add a melodic line to that work in progress and have effect on music. And it's more like jazz in that sense, in that the other musicians in the systems will respond to your addition. The important thing to do is to do this in a deliberate and considered way so that the response reinforces the things that you want to see in the system and diminishes the things that you don't. In this mindset, because we're working with wholes, these solutions can have benefits for the entire system, not just the spot where you intervened. Okay, so with 1 and 2, this is the really big one. This is the one that completes the pivot from we are separate to we are necessary for a thriving world. So this is scarcity to abundance. Thinking about wholes, boundaries, and flows enables us to see dynamic life in its changing, evolving way of being, and that our work is part of that unfolding. And when we think that way, measures like this are not very helpful anymore. And you've seen lists like this in many briefs. I reckon we've all written some. And I now see these targets as a trap because they are expressions of, firstly, a scarcity mindset, which excuses us from any obligation to give. If there's a limited supply of stuff to consume, then the best I can do is consume less. And this stops me from thinking about the positive contribution that I can make. And secondly, it defines current performance based on comparing to past performance, which locks me into my current paradigm and holds me back from making any meaningful innovation. So these kinds of indicators are not going to move us forward. But what if we as engineers shifted the conversation to targets like this, to creating a definition of good which points to a thriving future that we would all love to live in and work to this brief, to engineer the future we seek with skill, consciously, deliberately, with every act of creation, to declare our commitment to these results. What kind of world could be a contribution to if we were able to use this crisis as an opportunity to shift this mindset? What might be possible if we were to truly own the responsibility of planetary scale impact? If we look to indigenous traditions, the mindset that they use is that the relationship with the earth is a partnership. The earth is a thou, not an it. She is in a constant state of evolution, and she wants us to be an engaged participant in that process. If you're uncomfortable with personification, you can think of nature as a system whose reason for being is to develop increasing levels of sophistication in the expression of carbon-based life. And as part of that system, we are meant to use our creativity and ingenuity to enable that development. Simply put, the opportunity of this crisis is for humanity to accept the invitation to become part of this system again. So what is the engineer's role in that? Well, one meaning of engineer is to skillfully arrange for something to occur. As engineers, we're designers of structures, processes, and infrastructure that enable pre-agreed results. We can frame our work so that what we make exemplifies and encourages the role of humans as custodians, as an expression of our awareness of the fact that we are an essential player in the success of this system, rather than an external manipulator, that we can behave as an engaged participant with a vested interest in a good outcome. There is still time to choose what this word will mean. And rather than have this truth be something to shy away from, let's acknowledge the scale of our impact and use it wisely and well. Let's engineer an outcome where all living systems are thriving, and humanity is an active participant in that success, where we're aligned with nature, working with it, instead of pretending that we're separate. I think sailboats are a beautiful example of the elegance of combining engineering skill with the power of nature, So I'll leave you with this image. I hope today is inspiring and energizing for you with lots of ideas about what we can do. But I'll remind you that first and foremost, it's not about what we do. It's about who we're being. It's not about what we design, but why we're designing it. And being clear about what we're in service to and celebrating the whole of which we are a part. Thank you.
So this is definitely a shift in the way we used to do things and deliver projects, or even how we see the world around us in day-to-day living. So I have the privilege to work with Mary and adopt this way of thinking as a manifesto in delivering projects and addressing problems. So thank you very much. So please use the Q&A for questions. We have one from Richard. There is a growing empirical evidence that we cannot decouple our economic growth from resource consumption. Can we sustain prosperous communities in steady state or degrowth economic conditions, and how? Mary.
Well, trust Richard to give me a question that would take an entire conference to answer. So thanks, mate. Yeah, I think I am not an economist, and I know that there are a lot of people who are working on this question. And I'm encouraged by the development of things like circular economy and donut economics. But I also understand what Rich is pointing to, which is that neither of those models quite yet get us to an acknowledgement that you can't have infinite growth in a closed system. So I suppose the key shift for economic thinking is to look at that part about aligning our systems with natural systems. So understanding that we don't have an infinite amount of space in which to grow, and that nature, I think maybe there's a role for biomimicry to play in helping us crack this nut, because nature seems to know how to work with a finite set of resources and continue to make beautiful, amazing things and prosperous and thriving forms of life. So that would be my suggestion.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you. I hope, Richard, that answered your question. Otherwise, we may have to go back to create a bigger conference about it. Please, just fire away your questions on the Q&A tab while we're waiting. Mary, just a quick question. Why do you think we haven't so far today adopted such a way of thinking? What stopped us? What put us back today?
Well, I think I used to get frustrated about why people are reluctant to change. But I recently seen a couple of TED Talks and read a couple of books about how people's brains work, and that we don't tend to make change unless we get a really strong signal that our survival depends on it. And that's not because we're lazy or reluctant to see the writing on the wall. It's just that that's how our brains are programmed. So that, the example that I saw was that if we walk to a watering hole and we know that watering hole is great and the pathway there is safe, and someone says, hey, that watering hole is about to dry up in a year or two and there's a much better one over here, we're just not set up to accept the additional cognitive load to figure out the path to the new watering hole until we either get attacked by an alligator on the current one or the water's dried up. So the real potential here for engineers and people like the people who have come to this conference who see that we need to make a change to help other people understand how to make that change is to chart the pathway for them and sort of show them just come this way. We've already sort of cleared the path, and all you have to do is walk along it and take some of the stress out of it. So the ability to articulate the benefit of going to the new watering hole and the ability to provide some breadcrumbs along the way and sort of design these structures that assist people in making the right choices would be a really fantastic contribution, I think. Because it's not going to be easy. I guess that's part of why I'm saying it's not about can we solve this with technology. We need to need to solve it with our way of being in relationship to our Earth.
And maybe we need the right leaders in place to show us the way as well. Maybe that's another.
Well, that would be nice, but I guess I also think that we really cannot rely on this to be externally supplied. That it's really about each person in their own place becoming connected to that place, becoming native to that place. And I think indigenous people, both of these countries have terrific access to the wisdom of indigenous people to help us learn how to do that and to decolonize ourselves and get to where we really do understand and advocate for the places that we live in.
Okay. We have another question from Chloe, which is about existing systems. I find very interesting. It's how does this new way of thinking apply to existing systems that are already set in the scarcity mindset and don't need to change anything drastically? And so the spark to change how we think about things isn't there and will be there for a while.
Yeah, so I think on that graph of sort of, degenerative to regenerative thinking, there's different places that people are on in that journey. So we definitely need to have conversations about how to reduce and mitigate and avoid impact. So that's got to be happening. But we also want to shift people into thinking about, well, what can we do that is valuable and of benefit and will contribute to a thriving world. I feel like the idea of you probably can't overlay this new thinking onto an existing system that's based on reduced consumption, but you could put them together. So it's you're not finished when you've reduced consumption. There's more to think about. So one of the models that the Living Future Institute uses that I like is a handprint model. So you're not just thinking about your footprint, you're thinking about what are we doing that is of positive impact. Because there are going to be some things that we can't change drastically in the short term that will continue to have a negative impact. So if we can balance something positive to get to a net result of zero, that's better than nothing. But I do think we have a fairly short period of time to figure out how to get our infrastructure into a place of being net positive. And that's to my mind, and I'm not the only opinion here, but from what we've seen so far, manipulating existing technologies to try and make them perform better to get to a net positive result is pretty hard. So it's about thinking about things from a blank sheet of paper with that different set of goals. And there may be technologies that we have now that can be applied in service of those objectives. But maybe it's because I'm an architect by training, but I feel like and have become a project manager. I feel like we're working to the wrong brief. So if we're trying to reduce stuff, we're setting the team off on the wrong project.
Great, thank you, Mary. And I think that's all the time we have for questions at this stage. Please join me virtually in thanking Mary for the presentation and the time. Mary will also be available in the Person in Social Lounge, the first break, to answer any further questions or any questions that you raised on the Q&A and not be able to answer. Or alternatively, you can email her for any further questions at the email address, which is going to be shown in the next slide. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And thanks, CIBSE, for inviting me to speak today. I really enjoyed it. I look forward to the rest of the conference.
Thank you.